The Vulture is a fantastic Spider-Man villain in my opinion. He has a really cool design, he's much older than most villains, which makes him stand out, and he was played masterfully by Michael Keaton in Spider-Man Homecoming. However, we were supposed to get the Vulture a lot earlier than 2017. In fact, he was originally envisioned to debut in Spider-Man 3 instead of Venom. So, what if the Vulture had been in Spider-Man 3? Adrian Toomes, aka the Vulture, was always a villain that Sam Raimi wanted to use, but was never really able to. He wanted him to be in Spider-Man 3 instead of Venom, who honestly he never wanted to be in Spider-Man 3 because he doesn't like Venom very much, and he was hoping to cast the always great Ben Kingsley in the role. Now, I know I said before it was going to be John Malkovich, and it was in Spider-Man 4. This is Spider-Man 3, so it's different. Now, also, seemingly the plan was always going to have him be the father of Felicia Hardy, aka Black Cat, who would have been played by Anne Hathaway. Now, how would the Vulture's presence affect the events of Spider-Man 3? Well, I know that in the plans for Spider-Man 4, supposedly anyways, he was going to take over the Daily Bugle and fire J. Jonah Jameson, which I think is a terrible idea, so I think it would be a more natural fit to just put him at the company that seems to create every Spider-Man villain, Oscorp Industries, because honestly, it makes a lot more sense for me to just put him at Oscorp, since his Vulture suit looks a lot like the Green Goblin suit anyways. So in this version, Vulture's suit is a quote-unquote upgrade of the previous model, getting rid of that cumbersome glider in exchange for lightweight wings. So now we see, however, that Oscorp is still going out of business because of their multiple past failures, like, the stuff with Green Goblin and then the stuff with Doc Ock, which of course is technically Oscorp's fault. So now nobody wants to buy anything from them because of their history with experiments gone wrong. So now the new flight suit is collecting dust, and Adrian is about to lose his job, and he's trying to help his daughter Felicia get through college. So Adrian decides to steal the Vulture suit and begins robbing banks, where he of course begins clashing with Spider-Man. He would of course cause Peter to become even more stressed out in this movie, since he's already dealing with Harry Osborn and the Sandman, and now he has to deal with the Vulture too. Meanwhile, Peter also meets and befriends Felicia, Vulture's daughter, who he goes to college with. So yes, she takes the place of Gwen Stacy. There's no Gwen Stacy, and by extension, yes, that means there's also no Eddie Brock, because that's not what Raimi wanted to do. He wanted it to be the Vulture, and Black Cat was going to be the Vulture's daughter, so that's what we're going with instead. Now, Felicia has a very obvious crush on Peter Parker, but she's much more challenging for him than Mary Jane. She's a very flirty woman, she loves to flirt with Peter, and she's very outright about how she feels about him, so think Batman and Catwoman's dynamic, and this storyline would be interesting, because think about this, and this is a possibility, keep an open mind, that Peter might possibly become subconsciously more and more attracted to Felicia over time, because think about this, Felicia is not attached to his past, they haven't known each other that long, there's no Harry Osborn hanging over them, she doesn't know he's Spider-Man, they're not fighting all the time, Felicia is there for him, as a person to talk to that's not gonna, get into an argument with him all the time, because yeah, he loves Mary Jane, but they're fighting a lot right now, and Felicia's kind of there for him when Mary Jane and him are fighting, you know what I mean? So I kind of can't help but feel like Peter would get subconsciously just a little bit attracted to Felicia, even if he can't help it. And if you don't agree with me, then think about this. For one thing, he was actually clearly attracted to women like Ursula Ditkovich and Betty Brant, because in Spider-Man 3, under the influence of the suit, he was going after them. And you could say that was because of the suit, but I just think that was amplifying a part of him that was already there. So I do think he was already attracted to those women while he was with MJ. And on top of that, Raimi was always going to have Peter and MJ go through relationship problems no matter what in this movie, so I can imagine this happening instead of the stuff with Gwen. Now, I don't think he would outright cheat on MJ, mind you, but I do think that that's something that is being set up as something that might happen later. Either way, in the end, Vulture would take part in the finale, fighting alongside the Sandman against Peter and possibly Harry Osborn. At least I think. I know that there's no symbiote, and that changes a lot about this movie, so that means they don't have their house fight, or at least not the same house fight. So Harry might not find out that Peter is innocent of killing his father, but I'm really not sure. I do think that no matter what, Harry would switch sides, because that's what Raimi wanted for him to do. But how he would do it without the symbiote is unclear. But either way, if this were to happen, then I actually don't think Harry would die in this movie, because Vulture isn't that cruel of a character, and neither is the Sandman. So he actually lives. And in the end, the Vulture goes to prison. And that leaves Felicia pretty shocked, because she actually had no clue her dad was the Vulture. And this sets her up to try and make up for her father's actions by becoming Black Cat. So she becomes Black Cat out of the sense of guilt for her father's actions. And we see in the end that Harry Osborn is able to move on from Mary Jane, luckily, and he decides to go back to Oscorp Industries and try to undo all of the mismanagement that went on there. Peter and Mary Jane are still together for the time being, although the door has been left open in case Kirsten Dunst decides not to come back, because reports were suggesting she was not going to return for Spider-Man 4, and even if she had, I can't imagine her sticking around for Spider-Man 5 and 6. So I imagine that they would have set up Felicia to be the new main love interest going forward. Now, if you're wondering how I would get them together while still making Peter look good, I imagine that they would have had Venom be the main villain in Spider-Man 4. And now this would probably allow Peter and MJ to break up by having the symbiote influence Peter to hook up with Black Cat. Because honestly, that's the only way I could imagine Tobey Maguire, Peter Parker hooking up with Black Cat, is if he was under the influence of the Venom symbiote. Just let me know. I honestly don't see any other way that would have happened. If he was under the influence of the suit, I could imagine it, because the suit makes him do things he wouldn't normally do, honestly. So do I think this movie would have been better with the Vulture instead of Venom? In a word, yes, because, okay, I am well aware that Sam Raimi did not like using Venom, but I do think he got some things right with the symbiote. But, that does not mean it's a good movie. Spider-Man 3 is definitely not a good movie. It could have been worse, but it's not good. I think most reasonable people will agree with me on that. And I honestly think the symbiote would have been better served in Spider-Man 4, just because that was supposed to be the movie supposedly where Peter and Mary Jane split up. Because, yeah, I mean, it's kind of obvious to me Kirsten Dunst didn't want to stick around. Each movie, she seems to get less and less interested in it. The first movie, she's really bright and chipper and excited. Then the second movie, she's noticeably less excited. Then the third movie, she looks full-on miserable. And she almost didn't agree to come back for 4. So I imagine if she did 4, she would not have come back for 5 and 6. There's no way, in my opinion. And actually, in the initial draft for Spider-Man 4, they were actually going to have Peter and Mary Jane split up because Peter cheats on her with Felicia. And honestly, I can't imagine regular Peter doing that. So that's why I had this idea to bring Venom to Spider-Man 4, because I actually could imagine Peter cheating on Mary Jane with the symbiote, because the symbiote, as I said, makes him do things he wouldn't normally do. He does plenty of things in Spider-Man 3 that the Peter Parker we know and love would have never done. He's a lot more violent with criminals. He tells Sandman good riddance after he thinks he's killed him, and then he talks to Aunt May with pride about how he killed him. Well, not him, but you get what I mean. And, he snaps his fingers at women's butts, and, he's not a very good person. He takes Gwen Stacy to the nightclub to, show up Mary Jane like a complete douche. It makes him an asshole. Now, tell me if you can't imagine that asshole version of Spider-Man cheating on Mary Jane. It just would make more sense for me, in my opinion anyway, for Peter to have, slept with Black Cat while he was under the influence of the symbiote. Because the initial script had him do that without it, and I just can't imagine normal Peter doing that, honestly. And no, I don't think it's ideal for him to cheat on Mary Jane regardless. I'm not saying, oh, that's what they should have done. Okay, if they were going to have him cheat on Mary Jane, this is the best case scenario I think they could have done. Because honestly, I wasn't convinced by Peter, kissing Gwen Stacy. I was like, come on, Peter, you should know that's wrong. I wasn't convinced by his excuse at all. But now, if he was under the influence of the symbiote, that would actually be an excuse I could get behind. But no, I would not want that to happen, because I ideally wouldn't want Mary Jane to not be in these movies. I would want Kirsten Dunst to stick around for all 6 movies. I would want that. I think if you wanted to put Spider-Man with Black Cat, then it needs to be in the first movie. Imagine Tom Holland's Spider-Man cheating on Mary Jane, or I'm sorry, just MJ, with Black Cat. Imagine that. Can you imagine it? No. You can't imagine that Spider-Man cheating. So you can't imagine Tobey Maguire cheating either. So that's why I think the symbiote is the only way that would make sense. Now, as far as the Vulture himself goes, I'm sorry it took so long to talk about him, I think the Vulture would have been a great addition to this movie. As I said, Venom was clearly not wanted in this movie at all. all. And while I definitely think 3 villains is a crowd, like honestly, I definitely think this movie would have been probably better if it had just been Harry Osborn as the main villain and maybe Sandman and or Vulture as like a minor villain. I think that ultimately the movie would have been better if all the villains are ones Raimi actually wanted to use. And I ultimately think he would have done the Vulture better than he did Venom because that's a character he actually likes. Not to mention, all due respect to Topher Grace, he's no Ben Kingsley. Ben Kingsley is a phenomenal actor. You know, he was in Gandhi. He's been in a lot of really, really good movies. He's usually the best part of really crappy movies, including, you know, Prince of Persia, for example. That movie sucked, but he was really good in it. So, I mean, I think he would have made a fantastic Vulture, honestly. If ever there was a man who could play, you know, a big superhero movie villain, you know, with still a degree of nuance and subtlety, it would be Ben Kingsley. He's the right age, he's the right look, he's got no hair. I could imagine him being both a ruthless businessman and an average Joe up-and-comer trying to provide for his family. I could imagine him doing all of that. I could imagine him being, you know, an intimidating presence wearing that Vulture suit. Like, I really do think Ben Kingsley would knock it out of the park with the Vulture, and I know Raimi would direct the shit out of the Vulture. So I just think that's a match made in heaven right there. That is a perfect casting choice if you ask me. And Anne Hathaway's Black Cat is also perfect. Like, I mean, I know she wasn't the best Catwoman. She's no Michelle Pfeiffer in my opinion, but she was very good Catwoman. She's very underrated in the role, and I think she's got that femme fatale attitude down that I think would provide a really interesting dynamic to, you know, the Sam Raimi movies where we haven't seen something like that before. Not to mention, I think you could get some good comedy out of like this, you know, nerdy, dorky Peter Parker interacting with a woman like Felicia Hardy. I think that would just be really, really funny. And you know that Sam Raimi would be able to get a lot of humor out of that. I do think it's really interesting to think about how they would redeem Harry Osborn without the whole symbiote storyline. Because I'm guessing that whole house fight wouldn't happen. He wouldn't, you know, scar up Harry Osborn's face. But, you know, who knows, really, how they would have done that. Let me know in the comments down below. How do you think that they would have done the whole storyline where Harry Osborn and Peter fight, and then Harry redeems himself? I'd like to know what you guys think about that in the comments down below. Also, give this video a thumbs up and share with all of your friends on all your various social media platforms. Give me more what if recommendations in the comments down below, and I'll see all of you in the next video.